Good morning and welcome to Behind the Screen. I am JM, the GM, and we're here to just talk about games. Behind the Screen is a show where I just talk about my love of role-playing games, what games I'm playing, what campaigns I'm planning, hopefully giving out some good advice. Always enjoy interacting with the chat. So that's where we're starting at today. We're finishing up our look at science fiction, and we've been looking at science fiction for a while. We went back. You can go back on our YouTube channel on Iconic Production and go back and look at all of the different discussions we've been having about different genres. So we've done a lot of genres of fantasy. We're wrapping up sci-fi, and in January we're going to be looking at horror. But today we're finishing up with probably one of the most popular, if ill-defined, science fiction genres that we have, which is space fantasy or science fantasy, or as I have often called it, space wizards in the future past. So, we always start these off with the sources. What are the sources of our genre? And I think for everyone, the classic science fantasy source is Star Wars. You have all of the trappings of science fiction, and you have Jedi and all of their weirdness and their strangeness. Hey, Padre, good to see you this morning. So, there's a lot of science fantasy in literature, in science, or in media, in television shows, in role-playing games. And I think the key thing to keep in mind, and we'll talk about this more on Tuesday when we talk about the mechanics or what do we want to stress here. And the key thing here is that we are combining the genres of space opera with everything that entails vastness of space, the romantic elements, the exaggerated personalities, the archetypal Jungian, Campbellian milestones and archetypal markers with the tropes of high fantasy. So, strange powers, races that border on, or species and races that kind of are combined. Sometimes we have a very clear view of this in like Starfinder, where it's basically Pathfinder in space. John, good to see you this morning. So I figured we'd talk about the sources today. And again, I'll post links in the show notes of this episode if you would like to go see where some of these sources could be found. So in movies, I would say kind of some of our key markers are really any of the Star Wars television shows or movies that also have the Jedi in them. And I say that because Rogue One is probably the least science fantasy of all of the Star Wars movies. We have very high science fantasy in the prequel trilogies and in all of the things that take place during the Republic. Tales of the Jedi is probably still my favorite EU storyline and arc and time frame. Riddick, actually, or sorry, specifically the Chronicles of Riddick, a possibly not as well known movie. It takes place after Pitch Black. It is very science fantasy with the necromongers and the stealing of souls while still journeying across space in starships and all of these really interesting technological trappings. Some could argue that various points of the MCU and the DCEU have science fantasy elements. Anything that Jack Kirby touched is basically science fantasy. So the New Gods, Apocalypse, Darkseid on the DC component of that. Thor, especially the first Thor movie. Well, actually, I would say all of the Thor movies have an element of science fantasy to them. When we get into TV shows, again, probably my favorite is still Babylon 5. The further we get into Babylon 5, the more science fantasy it gets, especially with things like the techno mages and the transmission of souls and the soul hunters and all of that. Padre, yes, I am going to talk about Fading Suns today. It is very much science fantasy, and I'm glad that you're enjoying the Oh Boy game. That is a massive campaign. We ran Fading Suns for 3 years. If you are at all interested in checking out some of our past shows, you can go over to our YouTube channel. We have our Fading Suns game, a lot of our Torg game, and a Deadlands game that we ran. We ran a 12-week Deadlands game, the horror at Headstone Hill, which was just wonderful. Yeah, the Thrawn trilogy is also amazing because Thrawn is the best villain in the Star Wars universe, just hands down. In the modern era, I mean, Exar Kun is pretty cool in the Tales of the Jedi era, but that's an Ulic Quen-Keldroma, depending on where in his arc you follow. When it comes to books, we see a lot of science fantasy. Books of the New Sun and Books of the New Earth, or Earth of the New Sun, are science fantasy looking at it from different directions. One could argue, and I think this is in a review I read, that Books of the New Sun is science fiction masquerading as fantasy, and Earth of the New Sun is fantasy masquerading as science fiction. If you've not read Gene Wolfe's Books of the New Sun, I highly recommend them. They take place so far into the future that technology has become magical. Jack Vance's Dying Earth is the same way. The Dark Angel trilogy, which is one that I read in middle school or high school that I don't know, has never been a very popular series. I don't know anyone else who's actually ever read it, but it's this story about vampires on the moon, and then it turns into a war versus kind of this witch figure who is replaced, removes the heart of her sons and gilds them in lead and puts them back in their bodies to make them vampires. I think one of the last book is like The Pearl of the Soul of the World. It's a very weird series, and I still adore it to this day. Deathgate Saga by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, the Dark Sword trilogy by the same people, and the Shannara series all are very much science fantasy as well. They take place in a future after which Earth has been devastated and magic has returned. In some cases, magic has returned. In other cases, like in the Deathgate saga, I believe it is just a type of quantum physics that no one really understands anymore. But they understand that if they do this way, they can shift reality to where what they want to have happen is possible. When we get into role-playing games, when we really see, I think, a lot of great examples. I'm going to start with Padres because, man, Fading Suns is a beautiful game. And while it owes a lot to Dune, yeah, I guess I should have said spoilers on that, John, too. When you get to, well, it owes a lot to Dune, the series by Frank Herbert. Bill Bridges and the crew of Fading Suns really pushed it even further. And so you do have these elements that we would consider science fantasy. So you have demons, you have prayers that work, you have psionic powers that border on magic, you have artifacts that were crafted that kind of defy science and take on a more mystical or magical, arcane edge to them. Another great one is Rifts, which if you follow along at all, you know how much I love Rifts. In the fact that it is super high magic combined with super high technology. And it really goes into the space opera side if you step into Phase World and the Three Galaxies, because that's really where you get the spaceships and the space opera side of things. Cosmonites are kind of the quintessential space fantastical element. But even in the Three Galaxies, you have the United Worlds of Warlocks, which is a entire space faring empire that runs on magic. It doesn't run on technology. If Bob were here, he would probably argue with me on this, but that's just because I feel like 40K is so large. You'll notice that we talk about some of the similar things across multiple genres because they fit in multiple genres, right? A genre is not a box that you can clearly define. As we said before, it's a Venn diagram that kind of draws a circle around several elements. So, all right, John, I will see what we can do. I've got to check my schedule. It may have to wait to January, but I really want to get another Rifts game in. 40K borders on science fantasy because, man, the psionic powers and the ruinous powers of chaos are practically magical. And you have elves and dark elves, and squats are back. Um, these are all elements of fantasy that have spread throughout the universe. Padre just brought up Star Wars, and I would agree. The West End game Star Wars is, in my opinion, the best version of Star Wars. And it could be because it was one of the first games that I played. Tatooine Manhunt is still like in my head as one of the best adventures ever written. I ran that thing just multiple times for Star Wars and then a ton of times in other adventures because, or in other systems, because it's just a great adventure that's easily adaptable to kind of whatever setting you want. The other couple ones that I wanted to touch on quickly as we talk about our sources, especially in role-playing games, because this is a channel about gaming, are kind of the granddaddy of it, Spelljammer, which has just seen a release for 5th edition. We can talk about the merits and flaws of that another time, but Spelljammer basically created a ether-like transition and space fantasy way of connecting all of the D&D worlds. You have pirates, you have mind flayers on these spelljammers. Your ship is a is a sailing ship, but it uses magic to traverse the spaces between worlds. Evernight, which hopefully John Doom knows about, is one of my favorite science fantasy plot points that Savage Worlds put out. I do not want to spoil. If you have not played Evernight, I will post a link where you can get the PDF. You should try Evernight. It is pretty amazing. The pitch is it's a fantasy world and the sun goes out. And just trust me when I say it's science fantasy. Maybe actually the granddaddy of them all would be the Barrier Peaks module, which is one of the first D&D modules, and as you're running this dungeon, it turns out to be a crashed spaceship. I think some things that get lost more recently in modern views of role-playing games is that when you look at the original D&D, like OD&D, Basic, and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, there is a massive amount of science fantasy in there. You have things like psionics in there. You have the crashed spaceship as a dungeon. You have things that could almost be called alien races that are coming in, right? Even the Far Realm and all of the aberrations that come out of there is an homage to Lovecraft and this sort of science fantasy feel. Lovecraft has the elements of science fantasy, even though it's earthbound, because all of the magic is essentially just technology and science that people don't understand. Yes, Pathfinder has elements like that in Golarion. Is it Numidia? No, not Numidia. Numerian, where there's no magic, but they have, a spaceship has crashed. And Padre, once again, is apparently on the same wavelength as me because they take all of those elements and then they made Starfinder, which is probably the best designed from the ground up science fantasy, specifically science fantasy game that I have seen. I really enjoy that one. So I think that sort of covers it. I mean, one more, just an honorable mention, I guess. Monty Cook's Numenera. I have a great love of the art and the production value and the setting. The system sort of leaves me cold, but it does have a great science fantasy vibe. It was based off, inspired by, I should say, Books of the New Sun, and that's just great. Yes, John, I will post that link on Evernight. So if you're watching this live, when it gets to YouTube, I post several affiliate links, which, just to point out as an affiliate link, if you click on them, I get a little bit of incentive for you guys using that. Just full disclosure, if you will. But I will post links to all of these when this video goes up, and I'm really looking forward to talking about this because I think that you guys know I love Torg. I run Torg a lot. Torg has a lot of these elements, but aside from the party, and if you play in my games, the adversaries, Torg does kind of keeps the chocolate and the peanut butter separate. Isle's an Isle. Tharcold has a little bit of these elements, but Pan Pacifica's and Pan Pacifica. Rifts just takes all of the ingredients and stirs them around. And so that kind of is what we're looking for in this genre. Hey, Rook, good to see you, buddy. Man, Numenera to Savage Worlds would probably solve most of my problems with that. Although we should talk about someday, I'm going to add this to the notes, broad settings versus deep settings. And I think Numenera is a very broad setting. Most settings start off very broad because they want you to kind of see what the landscape of the world is. I prefer kind of deep settings where we focus on a small area and we go really deep. Jackals, Amboria is going to be a deep setting. There are several of these that are also deep settings. Oh, another great, if you enjoy mega dungeons and dungeon crawls, check out Dwimmermount. Dwimmermount is a very science fantasy mega dungeon. Involves, going to Mars, and where the elves are from Mars, and some of the gods are actually hyper intelligent space computers that just kind of fly around and transmit energy to their followers, which are the divine spells. Very cool stuff. Yes, the Cyber Papacy kind of falls in line as this as well, but again, a little bit more, not so much on the space side, but more on like the cyberpunk. It kind of fits in with elements of magic. So yeah, I can see that. So that is the end of our look at the sources. I know we covered a ton of stuff. Expect me to post the links, and I'll copy them over into the Iconic Production Discord channel. So if you're on there, you can check that out. We'll be back on Tuesday. We're going to talk about mechanics, what things really need to have structure around them in a game that you're running for science fantasy. And then we will end our streams for the year next Thursday and round out our look at science fiction. So until then, I hope all of you are enjoying the holiday season, that it is smooth and enjoyable and not stressful for you. We will be back on Tuesday with more Behind the Screen and our holiday episode. And so until then, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. I am JM. This is Iconic Production, and we will see you all later. Have a good one.